From downtown Milwaukee, welcome to Money Talk with Bob Landis. Each week, professional advisors from Landis & Company Investments discuss the latest financial developments, offering timely insight and long-term perspective.
This is Money Talk for Easter weekend 2025. Let's check the calendar. The Brewers are home for the weekend with the Oakland A's, and your Milwaukee Bucks start the NBA playoffs Saturday in Indy with the Pacers. At Eline Hall, it's the Share Show without Sonny. How about Saturday? It's Lisa, Edgar, and Razzmatazz at Egg Day at the Zoo. Oh. And you can't swing a dead cat without hitting an Easter egg hunt. They're everywhere. Today we have a series of bizarre stories that I call, What's Wrong with These People? First, a Christian nationalist minister claims the scanners used at airports to detect weapons turn people gay. Oh, it gets better. Missouri cops are investigating a foster mom for trading a foster child for a monkey. She did it, she explains, so she could boost her exotic animal collection. And finally, a 45-year-old woman in Utah was arrested last week for leading the cops in a high-speed chase. The cops laid down spike strips to flatten her tires, and it worked. She had 4 flat tires. The drunken driver then called AAA for road assistance. So what is wrong with these people? On the podcast today, we have Adam Baley, Mike Hoelzl, Joel Driesing, and wrapping up the week, here's Kyle Tetting.
Well, thanks, Max. A bit of a calmer week, but still down for the markets. The Nasdaq down 2.6%, closing on a Thursday, trade-shortened week, down 438 points. The S&P 500 down 81 points on the week. That's 1.5%. And the Dow Jones Industrial Average lost 1,070 points after a very rough day for United Healthcare on Thursday, taking the Dow down 527 points on the day, down again 1,070 on the week. That's 2.7%. For the year, NASDAQ down 15.6, the S&P down 10, and the Dow Jones Industrial Average down 7.8%. Adam, maybe the place to start this week, getting into the heart of earnings season. The hope, I think, at least for investors, is that it might give us a little more hard data, a little more sanity amidst what's been a lot of uncertainty. No shortage so far, at least, with the banks being kind of the first to go generally. No shortage of statements, no shortage of comments coming out. I was struck by the Bank of America CEO, Brian Moynihan, maybe potentially understating a little bit the impact that tariffs have played.
Yeah, his statement is we're facing a changing economy in the future. Well, thank you, Captain Obvious. Yes, we know that. It was a very general statement, but we are really looking for a whole lot more clarity this earnings season, clarity on how the trade war is likely to impact earnings, not just in the near future, but if this is longer-term impacts that they are anticipating. We've only had a handful of earnings reports so far this quarter, a lot of them banks, and those are looking pretty good. Consumers looking relatively resilient, but then again, that is kind of in the first 2 to 3 months of the year before tariffs really kind of took place. So we might not have all of that tariff-induced data until later on this year. We've seen earnings projections already walked back from where we started this year. Earnings, when we began January 1st, earnings growth for the S&P 500 was expected up to be somewhere around 15%. Then it got walked back to 12 and then 10, and it's a little less than that at the moment. Some of those earnings that were expected this year appear to be pushed into future years. Maybe in 2026 we'll start to see some of that earnings growth, but some of it is being meaningfully walked back so far this year.
And really hard to get a gauge, at least so far, on how much the tariff piece is impacting forecasts. Estimates tend to rely on what we know, and we don't know much still. We know what was proposed, we know what was then paused, but we don't know where all these negotiations are going to settle. And so I think the kind of earnings piece of the conversation is still a big black box. Mike, I know you've already transitioned into playoff basketball here, but worth maybe touching on, the fact that we've seen a broadening of the market. At the start of the year, it wasn't the tech stocks leading the way. We've seen non-tech stocks tend to hold up a little better, and it was interesting to me in the FactSet data this week. One of the things they pointed to was the fact that we're actually seeing some more participation on the earnings side from non-Mag 7 companies.
And that's been a really nice thing with, this downturn in the market, that even when we have those up days, you're seeing a real broadening of the market. As like I've been telling clients for the past few years, and we've said on the podcast numerous times before, the market has been dragged along, kicking and screaming by the Mag 7, just being pulled upward. And now that it's broadening out, it's going to be a really nice thing when the market does go up. When we get tariff clarity, I guess would be the way to go. Because what you've seen before, last week, when the tariffs were paused, the market does want to go up, right? With all the talk and kind of all the chaos we've seen, unemployment's still low. People still spending, according to Brian Moynihan. I want to get his name correct here. I haven't talked to him in a while. But the whole point of it is, if we get some tariff clarity or an extended pause, or they just go away, the market wants to go up, and that's going to be really driven by those other 493, right? It's starting to broaden out. We're seeing, as we talked, NASDAQ is down, 15.6 this year, but the S&P down 10, Dow down 7.8, as you said. And if you look at kind of the different sectors, the value stocks are holding up well. The blended stocks that are even more value-leaning are holding up well. So it's nice to see that we're getting the broadening, and I just think that even with the revenue and growth numbers, if tariffs go away, that broadening out is really going to help the market kind of push upward.
Kyle, maybe this is a good point to talk about the difference between the S&P and the Dow, because you had mentioned before that the Dow, went down more than the S&P this week, and you attributed it to one stock, to United Healthcare.
One name, United Healthcare, 9% of the Dow Jones Industrial Average, based entirely on the fact that it has a high stock price. That stock price isn't a reflection of the importance of the company in our economy. It's a reflection of the fact that United Healthcare chose to allow their stock price to not split, to not do anything that would otherwise have impacted it. And so when you look at United's position in market capitalization weighted indexes, an index that actually looks at the relevance of the company and the total value of it based on its underlying shares, well, in the S&P, where we have a market cap weighting, it's less than 1.5%. And so I think a real obvious case of don't rely too heavily on very narrow focused indexes when you're talking about how's my portfolio doing.
As a reminder for our listeners, the Dow Jones Industrial Average is 30 stocks. And we normally think of stock indexes as market cap weighted. The Dow goes back a long time, and they use price weighting, which is the old school version, mind you, of market cap weighting. And it just so happened that United Healthcare was the highest price in the Dow until today. So it had an outsized effect on the Dow's performance, just FYI. And
we're talking around it a bit, but so 9% of the Dow, down 20-some%. It was down 24%, I think, at its lows today. Entirely a function of an earnings report that suggested that Medicare Advantage participants, so United Healthcare sells to the Medicare supplement, Medicare Advantage participants were using too much health care in the first quarter. That was more or less the reason why they missed their earnings expectations. And so, just to be clear, not really much of a story on longer term where are any of these stocks or these indexes headed, but very much a function of, yeah, we missed because we did too much of the thing that we're paid to do. I would also mention that I think we got some clarity, Adam, on interest rates this week, and we talk about how it's all about earnings and interest rates. Well, the interest rate story has largely been driven by fear initially as stocks fell, and then some fear that maybe the inflation problem isn't solved, maybe there might be some outside influence on our treasury market, some concerns that maybe the dollar as the reserve currency were in question, all kinds of things that kind of led to this wild week last week in treasury yields. And now this week we've got stock markets down, bond prices coming up as interest rates came down. We seem to be back to the relationship we tend to hope for.
Yeah, and a lot of it has to do with Jay Powell and the Federal Reserve. They did speak this week, and the Federal Reserve leaves steady interest rates for now. They essentially just said, look, there is too much uncertainty with tariffs and how much that could push up inflation. We don't yet have clarity on how much of an impact that will be. In addition, they don't yet have clarity on how much it could impact the labor market in a negative way. So with these two competing forces and significant competing forces, they just cannot make a decision to change one way or another. So they're going to leave steady for now. At a time when ECB finds more clarity in their economic future, they decided to cut. And that did create a fair amount of turbulence in the market this week.
Yeah, Christine Lagarde at the ECB, some really interesting statements in announcing the rate cut. I think the most relevant of which was in discussing what we call the neutral interest rate. What's the rate that would be neither accommodative or restrictive? We think in kind of Fed terms here in the U.S. right now that the overnight lending rate is probably still a little restrictive, maybe a little more than a little restrictive. And so if you cut rates, you're not accommodating the economy. You're simply bringing it back to something that would be a neutral rate policy. And in answering a question on, well, what is the neutral rate right now for the European Central Bank, Lagarde's comments were basically that it's useless to try to identify that number right now, given how uncertain the world is, given how uncertain I think the negative demand shock was the specific quote that she came back to there. And it is, I think, an interesting stance on kind of what we're dealing with from a global economic perspective.
What I find interesting about the kind of interest rate conversation is you hear the administration saying they want rates to go down, they want the Fed to cut, they think it's too high. But if you look at kind of the past inflation reports that we've seen, if they did nothing with terms of tariffs, and not even talked about them, or just they were just a fever dream and didn't really happen, the Fed probably would have cut at this point. Just because you're getting some pretty decent inflation. I mean, maybe not a ton. They probably would have cut at least once. Just from like talking to them, as Adam said, they're almost in a bit of a no-win situation right now, where if you cut too early because you don't see the effects of tariffs, there could have some negative consequences. But I find it interesting after the inflation report comes out, which was a pretty good one at this point. If we don't talk about tariffs, they're probably cutting, and that probably has a pretty decent effect on housing too, because mortgages right now are up over 7%, and that's just kind of stalling it out as well. So I thought that was kind of some of Powell's comments, but also the last inflation report just kind of made me think, well, maybe if these go away, we might still get some cuts this year. But again, they're, as Adam said, they're in a bit of a holding pattern right now for sure.
The Fed chair actually said at one point stagflationary shock. So that means what? That the economy is stagnant, it's not growing, but we still have higher inflation.
And that is, I think, their core worry, giving them pause, is that what if the economy does slow, but inflation remains high? We've seen that in our economic past. We had that throughout the 70s and at some point the 80s. That was a painful time. And I think they are cognizant of our economic history, which is why they just gave pause this week.
But the inclusion of the word shock in that tells me that he's looking for what all of you have mentioned is clarity.
I mean, stagflationary shock sounds like a Rush album title from like the 70s.
Or a drink.
I think the Federal Reserve made clear in the aftermath of our prior stagflationary period that was a world they never wanted to go back to. That the purpose of the messaging now is, how do we ensure that the market understands that we don't want to get back to a place where economic growth is non-existent or negative, but we still have those inflationary pressures. And the problem, of course, is that the Fed really only controls a small portion of economic activity. And they really only have one tool, or, they've created a few more in the last 15 years, but they have a limited toolbox with which to do it. And so when you beat the economy over the head with the uncertainty that is tariffs or any number of other things, financial crisis, they have to be clear that, our tools aren't terribly well equipped to deal with this near term. And I think that's what we're hearing is we're going to wait and see. We still have to be data dependent, but our messaging is only as good as the war we're fighting, and we don't have the tools for this. We talked, Joel, earlier about Brian Moynihan's comments that the consumer, at least through the first quarter, was fairly resilient. We saw that in the retail sales data for March, but an early indicator potentially as we continue to go forward that that could shift, but depending on all the rest of this conversation.
Right. Again, it's March. It's past. And it did show resilience. It showed broad growth. It was the highest percentage growth in retail spending in 2 years, more than 2 years, led by car sales. And that can, I mean, you can speculate what that is. And some analysts are saying it's panic buying. It's people who are worried that cars are going to cost more, so you better buy one quick. Part of it could be people replacing vehicles lost in the fires in California, or people going to the building centers and getting lumber for their home repair projects for disasters that happened in the last quarter. All sorts of things. But the numbers look good, and it's encouraging that whatever's happening, that consumers are still spending because, as we keep saying, they drive the economy.
And then industrial production, which historically a much bigger part of our economy, much smaller now, but some signs that if not for maybe a little warmer weather, things were okay there.
Yeah, the one thing that was holding back industrial production was that we had a warmer than expected first quarter, and so utilities weren't putting out as much energy as they would have otherwise in the winter. And otherwise, I mean, it looked pretty good because manufacturing output was up for the fifth month in a row. Overall, the first quarter industrial production went up on a 5.5% annual growth rate, and that's pretty strong,
I'd say. And then, we got some data on housing this week. We kind of looked to a couple of different pieces always of permits and construction starts and new homes, and a little bit more clarity on some of that this week.
If you look at the shorter run on those numbers, it's less encouraging. It looks like it's weakening, and it has been weakening, but that's because it really shot up after the COVID pandemic. And actually, we're about where we were on all those different indicators, about where we were when COVID began. And when COVID began, we were building houses and taking out permits at a rate that we hadn't seen since before the Great Recession. So we were just starting to recover from that, and we're about at that level now, which isn't bad, but we still have to make up for those years in between where we weren't building any houses. And again, remember that the new housing market is 1/10, less than a tenth of the overall real estate market, but that's important.
Yeah, and household formation, which I'll come back to every time, is a function of having new houses, and population growth is important for that, but also getting people into those homes is important, which means the affordability thing, Mike, that you were talking about earlier, the stuff we're talking about now in terms of having those new homes that you need to fill with new furniture and new fridges and all the others. And so I think, if our economic activity continues to be tied to consumption, well, then we're going to need to continue to find ways to drive people to consume. And, again, I think so far we've done that very well.
And again, we have those warnings. We had the report from the University of Michigan last week that consumer sentiment is really low. We're going to have a final report for the month of April from them next week, so that should give us a little more clarity there.
Clarity is about all we can hope for. So with that, we enjoyed doing the program for you. We'll talk to you again next week.
Thank you for listening to Money Talk with Bob Landis. If you have a financial question you want answered on next week's show, email it to moneytalk@landis.com. To keep informed throughout the week, visit our Money Talk page at landis.com.